Welcome to G-Man Reviews, where we break down games, stories, mechanics, and ideas behind them, and not just whether something is good or bad, but why it works, where it falls short, and what it says about the genre it belongs to. So today's episode is called Mouse P.I for Hire and the Soul of Noir. I wanted to talk about the game Mouse P.I for Hire, but specifically I wanted to talk about Mouse P.I as a Noir game. I already released a review of the game before when I had just been about maybe a couple of hours in, which was more like a general overview. This one is more about specifically the game itself, as how it goes far more in depth than the previous review. The previous review was like an overview. This is more like meant to be an in-depth review. Because this is a game that has caused some interesting debate online, some people love it for its rubber hose cartoon art style, its boomer shooter gameplay, its jazz soundtrack, and its 1930s detective atmosphere. But others have criticized it for not having enough actual detective work, for being too much of a shooter, for its difficulty depending heavily on the weapons you use, and for some of its levels locking off after completion. And then, of course, you have the more culture war side of the discussion, where some people have asked whether Mouse P.I is woke. So today I want to tackle the whole thing properly. I want to talk about the criticism of the game, the IGN-style criticism that the game may not fully deliver on its detective fantasy, the question of whether its political themes actually fit noir, and why I think this game understands the heart of noir much better than some critics give it credit for. Because my position is this: Mouse P.I for Hire is not a perfect detective game. Its detective mechanics are weaker than its shooter mechanics. Its platforming is not its strongest element. It badly needs a new game plus mode. But as a noir story, as a world, as a creative vision, this game absolutely has soul. And honestly, for me, it gave me the rare feeling you get when a game comes out of nowhere and reminds you that games can still be made with real vision. Not because it is the same size or scope as Baldur's Gate 3, but because it gave me a similar feeling of surprise. A team had a strong creative idea, committed to it, and made something that actually feels alive. So let's get into it. Section 1. The IGN question, and is this a noir game or a shooter in a trench coat? So let's start with the criticism. The big argument against Mouse P.I is that it looks like a detective noir game, but often plays more like a stylish boomer shooter. And honestly, that criticism is not completely wrong. A lot of the detective work in the game is not deeply interactive. You are not just sitting there manually connecting clues, interrogating suspects in a complex branching conversations, or solving cases through your own deduction in the same way you might in a pure detective game. A lot of the time, the detective side is presented through the story, the setting, the atmosphere, and the objectives. You find the clues, the game moves forward, the board updates, the mystery progresses. So if someone came into Mouse P.I expecting a full detective simulator, I can understand why they might be disappointed. But I also think that criticism can miss what the game is actually trying to be. Because Mouse P.I is not just one thing. It is not just a detective game, it is not just a shooter, it is not just a platformer, it is not just a cartoon throwback. It is trying to combine several things at once. And that brings us to the real question. Is Mouse P.I failing as a detective game, or is it succeeding as a boomer shooter with a noir detective story? That distinction matters, because if you judge this game purely as a detective simulation, then yes, the detective mechanics are not as deep as they could be. But if you judge it as a boomer shooter wrapped around a noir detective story, then I think it succeeds far more than it fails. So let's move on to section 2, where we talk about the 4 pillars of Mouse P.I. When you look at the game properly, I think it is built around 4 major elements. The first is boomer shooter combat, the second is platforming, third is a detective noir story, and fourth is detective gameplay elements. The game does not perform equally across all 4. The strongest parts of Mouse P.I are clearly the boomer shooter combat and the detective story. That is where the game has the most confidence. The shooting is fast, loud, stylish, and chaotic. The world has strong identity. The black and white cartoon visuals immediately make it stand out. The jazz, the crime, the corruption, the old school city streets, the mobsters, the political rot, all of that works. The detective story also works because Jack Pepper feels like a proper noir character. He's not some clean superhero. He is a tired, battered private investigator in a corrupt city, trying to do the right thing even when the system around him is rotten. But the weaker parts are the platforming and the detective mechanics. The platforming is there and it is functional, but I don't think anyone is playing this game because they think it is the next great platformer. And the detective mechanics are interesting, but they are not as interactive as they could have been. You are not really solving the case yourself in a deep mechanical sense. You are following the case as Jack uncovers it. Now, some people will see that as a flaw, and to be fair, it is a flaw, but I also think this is where we need to talk about scope. So we're going to move on to section 3 where we talk about scope matters. When people criticize games, it is very easy to say they should have added this, they should have added that, the detective mechanics should have been deeper, the platforming should have been more complex, the levels should have been more open, the story should have had more branching choices, and some of those criticisms are fair. But when you are making a game, you have to think about scope. You cannot make everything equally deep unless you have the budget, time, and manpower to support it. If Mouse P.I. had tried to be a full detective simulator, a full boomer shooter, a full platformer, a full noir adventure game, and a full immersive sim all at once, there is a good chance the whole thing would have collapsed under its own ambition. So it seems pretty clear to me that the team made a choice. They focused on two pillars that mattered most. Make the shooting fun, and make Noir, the Noir story, memorable. And honestly, I think that was the right decision. Because when people are going to remember Mouse P.I., is not that it had the most advanced clue board ever created. They are going to remember the look, they are going to remember Jack Pepper, they are going to remember the city, they are going to remember the corruption, they are going to remember the shrews, and they are going to remember the way this game takes the innocence of old rubber hose cartoons and smashes it into the ugliness of noir. And this is where the game has its strongest identity. So yes, the detective mechanics could be deeper, but the game's soul is there. So let's talk about section 4 where we talk about the noir structure starting at the end. One thing that I really liked about Mouse P.I. is the way the story plays with structure. The game has that classic noir feeling of looking backward. Noir often feels like a story where the damage has already been done. The detective is not walking into a clean world and saving the day like a golden age superhero. He's walking through the wreckage, trying to figure out who caused it, who benefited from it, and whether there is anything still worth saving. That is one reason why the story structure works. Starting near the end or framing the story in a way that makes you feel like you are reconstructing the case fits noir extremely well. Because noir is often about inevitability. It is about the sense that corruption was already there before the hero arrived. The city was already sick, the institutions were already compromised, the powerful were already exploiting the weak. The detective is not creating the conflict, he is uncovering it. And that is exactly what Jack Pepper is doing. He's not just chasing random bad guys, he's pulling on a thread and slowly revealing how deep the rot goes. That is noir. Not just the black and white art style, not just the jazz, not just the trench coat. The real noir element is the feeling that the world is corrupt. The little guy is being crushed, and the hero has to decide whether he still has enough decency left to care. And that is where Mouse P.I. works. So we're going to move on to section 5 where we talk about Jack Pepper and the little guy. One of the story sections that really worked for me was when Jack is talking to John about there being a much better day for the shrews once they stop Captain Sims and the shrew ferrying operation. That moment genuinely tugged at my heartstrings. And the reason it works is because it captured one of the most important parts of noir, the down on his luck detective protecting the little guy. And in this game, that is quite literal. The shrews are the little guy. They are vulnerable. They are being exploited. They are being moved around and abused by a system that sees them as disposable. And Jack Pepper, despite being cynical, tired, surrounded by corruption, still has enough moral fire left in him to care. And that is what makes him work as a noir protagonist. A noir detective is not usually a perfect man. He's not pure. He's not untouched by the world. He may drink too much. He may be bitter. he may have a messy past, he may have been part of the system before walking away from it, but underneath all of that, there is usually one thing that still matters. He cannot stand seeing the powerless crushed. That is Jack Pepper. He may be a cartoon mouse with a gun, but in that moment with John and the shrews, the game shows you that Jack is not just a shooter protagonist, he is a detective with a conscience. And that is why I push back against the idea that Mouse P.I only has noir aesthetics. No, it does have noir themes. The Shrew storyline proves that, because noir is not just about solving crimes. It is about moral decay, it is about corruption, it is about abuse of power, it is about the people at the bottom being used by people at the top. And sometimes it is about one battered detective standing in the way and saying, no, not this time. That is why that scene worked for me. Section 6, Exposition, Corruption, and Jack's Moral Failure. One thing I also want to give Mouse P.I credit for is how well it handles exposition. A lot of games dump information on you in a clumsy way. They stop the story cold and have the character explain the plot, the politics, the villain, the world, and the hero's backstory at once. But Mouse P.I usually does a much better job than that. It often reveals information through the case itself. You do not just get told that the police are corrupt in some dry law dump. You experience it through Jack's investigation. You find out that the police captain Jack once idolized is corrupt. You also find out something even more important about Jack himself, that he was kicked off the force because he turned a blind eye to cover for his friend. That is classic noir, because noir heroes are rarely spotless moral champions. They are usually compromised people trying to claw their way back to something decent, and that makes Jack Pepper more interesting. He is not just a good man surrounded by bad people. He is someone who made a serious moral mistake. He looked away when he should have acted. He protected someone he cared about, and that choice cost him his place on the force. That gives his story more weight, because when Jack later stands up for the shrews and tries to stop the exploitation happening in Mouseburg, it's not just heroism, it's also a form of redemption. He failed once, he looked away once, but now when he sees the little guy being crushed, he does not look away. And that is why the story works. The game does not simply tell us Jack is a damaged detective. It shows us why he's damaged. It shows us that his cynicism comes from guilt, disillusionment, and personal failure, not just from being surrounded by corruption. And that is much stronger noir than a simple good cop versus bad system story. It also means the corruption in Mouse P.I feels personal. Jack is not standing outside the system like a pure hero judging everyone else. He was part of that world. He has relationships inside it. He made compromises inside it. He paid for those compromises. That is good noir. That is also good exposition. The game gives you character, theme, and world building at the same time. Section 7, the BMP, Corruption in the 1930s Aesthetic. Now let's talk about the BMP and the political side of the game. This is where some people have asked whether Mouse P.I is woke, and I think that is the wrong first question. The better question is, do the political themes fit the setting, the story, and the genre? And in this case, I think they mostly do, because the 1930s were not just jazz suits, cigars, old cars, detective officers, and black and white cartoons. The 1930s were also an era of economic desperation, political extremism, racial prejudice, organized crime, corruption, and rising authoritarian movements. So when Mouse P.I includes corruption, propaganda, anti-shrew politics, exploitation, and BMP-style street politics, that does not randomly feel stapled onto the game. That fits the world. It fits the era it is drawing from, and it fits noir. Noir has always had a connection to corruption, dirty cops, crooked politicians, criminal gangs, wealthy elites, broken institutions, people who are supposed to protect the innocent but instead protect themselves. So BMP works because it gives the game a political villain that makes sense in the genre. The game is not just saying, here is a bad guy because we need a bad guy. It is saying, here is a movement that feeds on fear, prejudice, and power. That is very noir. That is very 1930s. And that is why I do not think the game is DEI slop. I think that there is a very important distinction here. There is a difference between a story using political themes because they naturally belong to the world, and a story lazily stapling modern politics onto itself because it wants applause. In Mouse P.I, I think the themes mostly belong. The shrews are not just there so the game can tick a box. They are tied to the story. They are tied to Jack's role as the protector of the vulnerable. They are tied to the corruption of the city. They are tied to the noir theme of powerful people abusing powerless people. That is not fake depth. That is genre-appropriate storytelling. Now, that does not mean that every line lands perfectly. Sometimes the game can be blunt with its themes, but blunt is not the same thing as fake. And to be fair, Mouse P.I does a lot of showing rather than telling. The police corruption, Jack's guilt, the exploitation of the shrews, and the BMP's politics are not just explained in some detached law entry. They are revealed through Jack's case and the world he is moving through. And that is why I think the themes work. The game's politics are not separate from the noir story. They are part of the story. Section 8 is Mouse P.I woke. So let's address it correctly. Is Mouse P.I for hire woke? My answer would be not in the lazy corporate sense. If by woke someone means this game has themes about prejudice, exploitation, authoritarianism, and corruption, then yes, those themes are in the game. But those themes are not automatically bad. The issue is whether they are earned. And in Mouse P.I, I think they mostly are, because Noir has always been about the ugliness beneath the surface. The rich city with a rotten core, the charming politician with blood on his hands, the police department that protects the wrong people, the detective who knows the system is corrupt but keeps fighting anyway because somebody has to. So when Mouse P.I deals with corruption and abuse of power, that is not the game betraying Noir, that is the game doing Noir. And the fact that it does it through cartoon animals does not make it less valid. In some ways it makes it sharper, because the old cartoon style creates a contrast. On the surface, everything looks playful and rubbery and exaggerated, but underneath, this story is dealing with exploitation, fear, violence, and social rot. That contrast is one of the most interesting things about the game. It is cute and ugly at the same time, funny and grim at the same time, cartoonish and serious at the same time. That is why I think the woke criticism is too shallow if it stops at simply noticing that the game has political themes. The real question is, do those themes serve the story? And for me, yes, they do. Could the game be more subtle in places? Yes. Could some lines have landed better? Probably. But that is a writing criticism, not proof that the themes do not belong. And I would much rather have a game that has something to say, even if it says it bluntly, than a game with no soul, no point, and no moral imagination. Section 9, Combat and Difficulty, Your Weapon Choice Matters. Now let's move from the story into the gameplay. One of the criticisms of Mouse P.I is that the game can feel too easy or repetitive, and I think there is some truth to that, but I think it also depends heavily on which weapons you choose and which weapons you choose to upgrade. That is something that matters more than some people give it credit for. For example, if you lean heavily on the James gun, the game becomes much easier. The James gun has a strong magazine size, a high rate of fire, and gives you more room to correct mistakes while firing. You can spray into groups, adjust your aim mid-flight, and keep pressure on enemies without needing the same level of precision. That makes the game feel more forgiving, but if you rely on the pistol, the game changes. The pistol has lower ammo capacity, you have to be more accurate, you have to make your shots count, you cannot just spray your way through every encounter. And honestly, I think the pistol sometimes fits the noir fantasy better. A private investigator with a pistol feels vulnerable. A private investigator spraying enemies down with a high capacity weapon starts to feel less like a detective and more like a cartoon Doom guy. That is not necessarily bad. The James gun is fun. The heavier weapons are fun. The game is a boomer shooter after all, but it does affect the tone. The more powerful your weapon becomes, the more the game moves away from detective noir and towards a power fantasy. The pistol can make Jack feel like a detective in over his head. The James gun makes him feel like he came to clean out the entire city by himself. Both can be fun, but they create different versions of the game. So when people say Mouse P.I is too easy, I think their answer is partly which weapons were you using. Because the game's difficulty is not only about the difficulty setting, it's also about your weapon choices. If you choose the more efficient tools, the game becomes much easier. If you use the more limited weapons, it becomes more deliberate and more dangerous. That is worth discussing. So we're going to move on to section 10, where we talk about the shooter is strong, but it can overpower the detective fantasy. This leads into the bigger gameplay criticism. The shooting is one of the best parts of Mouse P.I, but it is also one of the reasons that detective fantasy can sometimes feel weaker, because when combat is the main way you interact with the world, the detective identity can get pushed into the background. Jack is a private investigator, but mechanically a lot of the time you are solving problems by shooting everything in the room, and that is where the game's identity gets a little complicated. On one hand, this is clearly part of the appeal. It is a boomer shooter. It is supposed to be fast, violent, and over the top. On the other hand, Noir is often about tension, investigation, moral choice, and vulnerability. So there is a natural clash there. A detective or story usually asks what happened here. A boomer shooter usually asks what is still moving and how do I kill it. Mouse P.I tries to do both, and most of the time I think it pulls it off through style and story, but mechanically the shooting side is much stronger than the detective side. That is why I would say the game succeeds more as a noir shooter than a true detective game, and that is not an insult, it's just a more accurate description. The detective mechanics could be deeper. Now, to be fair to the critics, I do think the detective mechanics could be deeper. I would have loved more moments where the player had to actually connect clues, not just collect evidence, not just trigger the next story beat, but really think through what happened. Imagine a clue board that gave you multiple possible connections and you had to choose which clues linked together. Imagine if suspects gave conflicting statements and you had to decide who was lying. Imagine if evidence could be interpreted incorrectly and your choices affected how Jack understood the case. That would have made the detective side much stronger, because right now the detective elements are more flavor and structure than deep gameplay. They help the story feel like a case, but they do not always make the player feel like the one solving it. That is a fair criticism, but again I come back to scope. The game already has shooting, platform, exploration, story, voice acting, bosses, secrets, upgrades, and a very specific visual identity. So while I do wish the detective mechanics were deeper, I understand why they might not have gone all the way with them. And honestly, this is one of the reasons I hope the team gets to make a sequel, because the foundation is there. If they can take this world, this tone, this character, and then add deeper detective systems in a sequel, that could be something special. Section 12, platforming functional but not the star. The platforming is another area where I think the game is weaker. It is not terrible, it works, but it is not the main reason to play the game. The movement and traversal can add variety, and it helps break up the shooting, but I would not say that the platforming reaches the same level as the combat or the visual design. And that is fine. Not every part of a game needs to be equally brilliant, but if we're being honest, the platform is one of the weaker pillars. The game is at its best when you are moving through the noir environments, fighting enemies and uncovering corruption and pushing through the story. It is less memorable when it's asking you to do platforming challenges. Again, that does not ruin the game, it just shows where the team's strengths are. The strength is not precision platforming, the strength is style, story, atmosphere, and shooter energy. Section 13, level lockouts and autosaves. Another criticism I saw people raise is that the levels can lock off, which can be frustrating if you miss collectible secrets or side content, and I think that criticism is fair. If a game encourages exploration, secrets, and collectibles, the players naturally want the ability to go back and clean up anything they missed. So when the completed levels become locked off or unavailable, this can feel annoying. However, I also think this criticism needs a bit of balance, but because the game does have autosaves during levels, and you can use those autosaves to reload the parts of a level if you realize you missed something, the game does not completely fix the issue. A proper level replay system would still be better, but it does mean the problem is not quite as severe as saying you missed something, now you're completely doomed forever. You may be able to reload an earlier autosave and grab what you missed. Still, I think this is an area where the game could improve. A level select system after finish the game would make sense, or better yet, a new game plus mode, and that brings me to one of my biggest practical criticisms. Section 14, this game badly needs a new game plus. So like I said, it really needs a new game plus mode, because this is the kind of game people may actually want to replay. The world is memorable, the style is strong, the story has enough personality that you may want to experience it again, and the combat can be fun enough to revisit on a higher difficulty or with a different weapon approach. But the replay experience would be much better if players could carry over some of their unlocks, because having to redo certain activities over and over again can become tedious. For example, having to play the baseball game another 20 times to get the alien weapon would really be annoying. That might be fine the first time, but on repeat playthroughs, it becomes busy work. A New Game Plus mode could solve this. Let players carry over weapons, let them carry over upgrades, let them carry over certain collectibles or bonus unlocks, or at least give them some kind of post-game mode where they can replay levels and experiment with weapons without having to grind everything from scratch. This would also help with the level lockout issue, because if players know that they can replay the game with their tools intact, they are less likely to feel punished for missing something the first time. And this matters because Mouse P.I is good enough to deserve replay support. That is the key point. I'm not asking for New Game Plus because the game is bad. I'm asking for it because the game is good enough and I want more reasons to come back. Section 15, the game style is not just a gimmick. Now let's talk about the art style, because this is obviously the first thing that grabs people. The 1930s rubber hose cartoon look is brilliant. It immediately gives the game an identity. In an industry where so many games blend together, Mouse P.I does not have that problem. You can look at one screenshot and know what game it is. That matters because the important thing is that the style is not just a gimmick. At first, you might think, oh, it's just a violent Mickey Mouse style shooter. But the more you play, the more you realize the cartoon style is doing something interesting. It creates contrast. The characters look playful, but the world is corrupt. The animation is bouncy, but the story deals with exploitation. The music is lively, but the city is rotten. The world looks like an old cartoon, but the themes are much darker. That contrast is what makes the game more than just a visual novelty. It is not simply saying, look, old cartoon style. It is saying, what if the world of old cartoons had a moral ugliness of noir underneath it? And that is a strong concept. Could the gameplay have leaned even harder into cartoon logic? Yes, I think that is a fair criticism. The enemies, bosses, weapons, and environments could have probably used more rubber hose absurdity in their mechanics. But visually and tonally, the style works, and it gives the game a personality that many bigger budget games simply do not have. Section 16, why the story worked for me. The reason I keep coming back to the story is because for me that is where Mouse P.I rises above being just a stylish shooter. The game's story worked for me because it had heart, and that is important. A noir story without heart is just cynicism. It becomes empty darkness, but good noir usually has something underneath the cynicism. There is usually some small moral flame that refuses to go out. That is what Jack Pepper has. He has seen corruption, he knows the city is rotten, he knows the powerful get away with things, he knows the little guy gets crushed, but he still acts. That action means more because Jack is not innocent. He turned a blind eye before, he covered for a friend, he made the wrong moral choice. So when he chooses to help the shrews, it feels more like than just a hero doing hero things. It feels like a man trying not to make the same mistake twice. That is why the shrew storyline matters. That is why the conversation with John matters. That is why the game's themes of corruption and exploitation matter. Because Jack is not just solving a case for money, he's standing up for people who cannot stand up for themselves. And that is classic noir. The detective may not be able to save the whole world. He may not be able to fix the entire city. He may not be able to undo all the damage, but he can save someone. He can expose something. He can make one corrupt villain pay. And sometimes in noir, that is the best victory you get. That is why I think Mouse P.I understands the genre better than some critics give it credit for. Section 17, my Baldur's Gate 3 comparison. Now, I want to fully explain something carefully. When I say Mouse P.I gave me a similar feeling to Baldur's Gate 3, I do not mean that they're the same type of game. Obviously, they are not. Baldur's Gate 3 is massive. It has huge branching choices, deep role-playing systems, major character interactions at a level of scale that Mouse P.I is not trying to match. So I'm not saying Mouse P.I is literally this year's Baldur's Gate 3 in terms of size, budget, or industry impact. What I mean is this, it gave me the same feeling of surprise, that feeling of, wait, this team actually cared. This was not a game that felt like it was designed by a committee to chase a trend. It felt like a team had a strong idea committed to it, a noir detective Mouse, a corrupt cartoon city, a boomer shooter with jazz mobsters, political rot, and rubber hose violence. That could have been silly, that could have been a shallow meme, but they actually made it work. And that is why this game shows promise. Because if this team can make something this distinct now, then I genuinely want to see what they can do next. With more budget, more time, and maybe more confidence in the detective mechanics, they could make something incredible. That is what excites me. Not that the game is perfect, it is not, but it has vision, and vision matters. So we're going to move on to section 18, where we talk about the fair criticism. So let me be fair and list the criticisms I think are legitimate. The detective gameplay could be deeper. The clue systems could involve the player more. The platforming is not as strong as the shooting. Some combat encounters can become repetitive. Weapon choice can make the game difficulty swing heavily. The James gun can make the game much easier, while the pistol demands more accuracy and creates a more deliberate experience. The level lockouts can be annoying even if autosaves help. The game needs better replay support, and it absolutely needs new games plus. Those are real criticisms. I'm not dismissing them, but I also think it's important to criticize the game for what it is, not for what it never promised to be. If you wanted a pure detective simulator, this probably will not fully satisfy you. But if you wanted a stylish boomer shooter with genuine noir detective story, then I think Mouse P.I delivers, and that is the distinction that matters. Section 19, Final Verdicts. So where do I land on Mouse P.I for hire? I think it is a flawed but genuinely impressive game. It is not perfect. It is not the deepest detective game. It is not the best platformer. It could use better replay options. It needs a new game plus, and some of its systems could absolutely be expanded in a sequel. But the game has something a lot of modern games lack: identity. It knows what it wants to feel like, it knows what world it wants to build, it knows who Jack Pepper is, and at its best it understands noir. Not just noir as a costume, not just noir as black and white visuals, not just noir as jazz and trench coats, but noir as a story about corruption, exploitation, broken systems, moral failure, and a battered detective trying to protect the little guy. And in this game, the little guy is literally the little guy. That is why it worked for me. The shrew storyline, the corruption, the BMP, the 1930s inspired political ugliness, the old cartoon style, the violent shooter gameplay, and Jack Pepper's tired but stubborn sense of justice all come together to make something memorable. So no, I do not think Mouse P.I is just woke DEI slop. I think it is a noir cartoon shooter that uses political themes in a way that mostly fits the genre. And no, I do not think the criticism is completely wrong either. The detective mechanics are weaker than a detective story. The shooter sometimes overpowers the private investigator fantasy. The game could do more with its clue systems. It badly needs a new game plus, but the foundation is strong. Very strong. And if this team gets to build on what they have made here, I think they could make something truly special. For me, Mouse P.I for Hire is one of those games that reminds me of why I still love games. Not because it is flawless, but because it has heart, style, and vision. And that is worth celebrating. That is my take on Mouse P.I for Hire and why I think it works as a noir story, even if it does not always work as a deep detective game. But now I want to know what you think. Did Mouse P.I deliver on the detective fantasy for you? Did you think the political themes fit the noir setting, or did they feel too blunt? Did Jack Pepper's story work for you as a noir redemption story? Or do you agree that this game badly needs a new game plus mode? Let me know, because I think this is one of those games that is going to be more interesting to talk about than people first expected. And if you enjoy deep reviews like this, where we look at games not just as products but as stories, genres, and creative visions, then make sure you follow the podcast, subscribe to the channel, and check out the written version over at gmanreviews.blog. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next review.